the mainstream media doesn't remind you that Israel was born in terrorism or through terrorism.
But so in a nutshell, like what you're recommending is if somebody says like no, the Israelis should have the right to expel the Palestinians because it has happened before, the answer is like sorry, one crime in the past doesn't justify another crime now, and the genocide against the Jews in the Second World War doesn't justify the genocide against the Palestinians by the Zionist Israelis. That must be the answer, right? And that's obviously what people who
It
do
is
logic
so
thinking
obvious
would
that, I mean,
conclude.
to argue anything else in a way is an insult to your intelligence, is an insult to my intelligence. And but these people have, shall we say, no morals. These people are not ethical. These people are so ideologically convinced that Zionism has to succeed in expanding Israel to frontiers that are absolutely unjust, unjustifiable. And you realize that Zionism, from its very outset, was a racial and religious and exclusionary policy, which is contrary to the entire human rights philosophy to which we are committed from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights through the Human Rights Covenants, etc. I mean, Zionism was an anachronism when it was first conceived at the end of the 19th century. It was already so, um, shall we say, medieval in its approach, so antediluvian in its approach. And what makes us all complicit is that you had a Balfour Declaration in Britain, and that you had the Brits pushing for this insane racist program that was then implemented against the will of the local population in Palestine. And it was quite clear that that was going to create a lot of trouble in the area. And you would hope that international lawyers would have already condemned that at the time. And the United Nations at the beginning, because the United Nations is responsible for the creation of the State of Israel, that the United Nations would have insisted that Israel respect its frontiers and that Israel allows the right to return. We have Resolution 194 of 1948 ordering the return of the Palestinians who had been expelled in the course of the Nakba. And people don't realize that Israel, its history, its prehistory, is terrorism. How did Israel come to be? It came to be through violence, through terrorist acts not only against the Palestinians, terrorist acts against the Brits. You will remember when the King David hotel was blown up and they killed, I don't know, maybe 100 Brits who were there. And there were any number of other terrorist attacks against the British in what was then Palestine. And then you have the United Nations trying to pacify matters, and they send in their envoy, Count Fokke Bernadotte. And Count Fokke Bernadotte is then murdered, assassinated by a group of Zionist terrorists. And that eventually became a famous case of the International Court of Justice. The mainstream media doesn't remind you that Israel was born in terrorism or through terrorism. And that reminds me, of course, of another book. That reminds me of the famous book by Martin Luther King Jr., a book called Why We Can't Wait. Why We Can't Wait was published in 1964. And Martin Luther King starts a chapter with the words, "Our country," meaning the United States, "our country was born in genocide." And I say, gosh, that's pretty tough. And then he goes into the genocide against the Native Americans, against the Algonquins and the Crees and the Cherokees and the Dakotas and the Mohawks and the Iroquois and the Sioux, etc. He's not talking about the Afro-Americans. He's not talking about slavery. He's talking about the extermination of 10 million indigenous Native Americans who had inhabited the entire continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Of course, they have somewhat recovered since then. There are about 2-3 million now indigenous in America, but it's been, I mean, one of these great tragedies of history, because you cannot reconstruct their culture, you cannot reconstruct their traditions, etc.
No.
I mean, we killed their buffalo and we burnt their crops and we burnt their villages and we massacred women and children. But then in the legend, in the myth of the American West, and that's where I was brought up in Chicago. I mean, we were by definition the good guys. Obviously, the cowboys were the good guys, and obviously the Indians were the bad guys. And that a myth dies hard. If you've been brought up with all of these myths,
Yeah.
it takes a long time to realize that you've been manipulated.
Which